are going to have the paper from Manjula ji about Rajadharma. The various aspects of Dharma are being covered in this session, and reflections on Rajadharma, political thought in the Puranas is from Manjula ji, and over to you, Manjula ji.
So, namaste everybody. I don't think you can see me for some reason, but here goes. So basically, my presentation is about Rajadharma, the political thought as presented in Matsya Purana. So first and foremost, I will, in all probability, it is a vast topic. So I will not be able to present everything that is there, even a literature study in 15 minutes, but I would love to give an introduction of how it is presented in Matsya Purana. So basically, why should we study the Puranas at all? I mean, this is a tautology, I'm sure, but here goes. So sociological treatises are like, Puranas are a snapshot in a certain time. So they'll give you a lot of information about how the society was there at a given point in time. And like my Mitraji was presenting, the previous presenter, like she was saying, it's an encyclopedic knowledge system. In Matsya Purana itself, you have, a lot of themes about like, Ayurveda and geography. Invariably, there is a lot of information about geography in every Purana. And there is like, in this particular thing, of course, there is a lot of information about polity and governance. More, it's like a framework, a strategic framework of how to view your own people, your enemies, and so on. So there is a certain strategic framework that is offered in Matsya Purana. And of course, every Purana has got the same stories. Every Purana is restating in a lot of ways the thematic, information of like, how to view things and how musicology or anything like, there is a certain repetition of themes in all Puranas, and the stories are also repeated. So that gives you an integrated and organic way of thought and information that is there. In our all our literature, we have this concept of Desha Kala Vastu Paricheda. So basically, here is the deal, like, certain information is relevant only in certain areas and only during certain times and so on. So an absolute truth is something that is standing the test of time, standing the test of like, what was in a particular region and so on. So truth is something that stands the test of Desha Kala Vastu Paricheda. So with that introduction, I'm going to jump right into this, what is offered in Matsya Purana. So we have a system of what is known as the Saptanga, the constituents of a polity, that is also reiterated in Matsya Purana. So the 7 branches or the 7 constituents of polity in strategic terms are the king, the minister, or of course the council of ministers, the Rashtra. Rashtra is a concept that encompasses the geographical entity as well as the people. And Durga, that is the forts, Danda, the army, Kosha, the treasury, and Mitra, the allies. Now, some of these may actually look kind of anachronistic, but there is a way in which you can actually see the framework and then apply to the current situation. The king occupied the primacy, he occupied the top of the polity, the pyramid, the top pyramid of the polity. The king was the executive head of the Saptanga. So, and such his safety was paramount. So he was under attack by his enemies. He was under attack by his own people, perhaps, both the internal and the external enemies. And he was perhaps prone to attack by poisons or various different threats. For example, he might be forced to drown, or he might ride a horse that is like, totally inappropriate, or an elephant that is in rut or something like that. A whole slew of dangers. So Matsya Purana addresses all those dangers. Like, he's not allowed to be with a woman who he doesn't know. He's not supposed to be riding a horse that is not tamed appropriately and, properly known to him, and so on. And the king's advisors, there's a whole chapter, that is devoted to the king's advisors and the kind of qualifications that each of those advisors will require, and so on. I will come to that a little later. I'll come to that in a greater detail a little later. So with this in mind, to make sure the continuity of the Rajasatta was maintained, the prince, a lot of devotion and a lot of time was devoted to prince's training. So there was succession planning and continuity in leadership, just so that the prince was appropriately trained, and he was given, he was made ready to occupy the next, he was next in line, so to speak. And that training included, he was given a lot of physical training to be a warrior. And he was given a lot of attitude training in terms of, like, what the Purusharthas were, and then what his attitude should be towards Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha, and so on. And then naturally, he was given a lot of training in diplomacy and exactly how to be disciplined, how to enforce discipline, how to be disciplined. So both of those aspects were given a lot of thought. And there is a lot of information about like how the king must treat his own son and prince, or whoever the prince. I mean, how he must treat him in terms of, like, how there's a certain amount of respect that he has to accord, a certain amount of affection that he has to accord, but there is a certain amount of withdrawal in terms of he's not going to enforce a lot of things and let the guy shine for himself, and then make sure that he's given appropriate bodyguards and such and so on. And he must watch him at all times. So that was the mandate that was given to the king. Similarly, there's a lot of information that is there about the prince's conduct too. Basically, how the prince has to deal with his trainers, with his people, with his father and king, and so on. The king's responsibilities were this thing that I thought this was very cute. So the code of conduct, the king's responsibilities. So unless Brahmavidhi, so the king has to follow a certain Brahmavidhi. And if he follows that Brahmavidhi, he will be secure. His position is going to be secure. So there will be Akshaya Vidhi. So there is that prescription about how he has to conduct himself, how he has to rule. And if he follows that, he's going to be secure as a king. That is the statement that is given in Matsya Purana. The king was responsible for protecting his people. He was responsible for honoring the educators of the realm, honoring the weak of the realm, like widows and people who are like, depending on him, his employees and his subjects and so on. So he was responsible for honoring his people, educators. Okay, I'm repeating myself. And then he has to be in loco parentis, in as much as he has to treat his subjects as his children. And he was required not to retreat from the battlefield. And I'm not sure if this prescription is to be taken as, sacrosanct, in as much as he has to be always engaged in the battle, but not necessarily like, that particular battle might or might not be. I'm not very sure how exactly it is treated. And he must always perform yajnas and yagas, and then give danas to the appropriate people, so that he will be pursuing spiritual attainment. And then he must patronize education and the study of the Vedas. He must uphold the Varnashrama Dharma. Varnashrama Dharma is the structure of society where all the professions had their own place. And there is this very interesting concept of destiny versus free will. I'll take a little bit of time on this. So basically, according to Matsya Purana, so there is always this argument about is destiny better, or whether free will trumps destiny and so on. So Matsya Purana has a very interesting way of conveying to the prince or whoever, prince in training, that destiny and free will are both very important. So, so it is elevated. It is elevated the concept of Uthana, the human endeavor, ascent. It is emphasized in all our literature, and Matsya Purana also emphasizes that. So according to our Matsya Purana thing, so basically he gives an example of a seed. Seed encapsulates destiny. When a seed is there, it comes as the form of a seed. It already encapsulates destiny. It is the fruit of the accumulated karma. So in the seed is contained how exactly the tree is going to be. But then free will and effort are equally important. The farmer must make sure that it is sown properly and it is fertilized properly and so on. And even with this, there is a time to fruition that is required. So unless the rains will happen at the right time and so on, and it is given an appropriate amount of time, the seed is going to become a seedling only in its own time. So the concept of destiny versus free will is very beautifully presented in Matsya Purana. So the administrators, the council in Matsya Purana consists of the minister, the commander-in-chief, the security personnel, officers in charge of armories, spies. There's a lot of material that is devoted to spies, accountants and writers, judges, emissaries, and ambassadors and treasurers. So there's a lot of information that is given in Matsya Purana about all these administrators. And there is a six-fold policy of how to deal with your allies and enemies. So this is again a framework of strategy which I find fascinating. So Sandhi is like an outcome of negotiation with both your allies and your enemies. And Vigraha, hostility. If Sandhi fails, you have hostility. And then how exactly do you carry out, a war? That is Yana, marching against an enemy or stationing defensive forces along the border. And then Asana is neutrality. Ashraya is alliance or friendship. And Dvaitha is waging war with one enemy, while making peace with another. So all these aspects of foreign policy are dealt with in detail. Okay, so this is something that I am going to, let's see how exactly, I'm not sure how, one second, give me a minute. Yeah, so there is this thing about, okay, I'm focusing on this king's personal physician in some detail, basically because the qualifications required for all the, council members, the members of the council, of the King's Council, are given in great detail. But I just wanted to highlight this particular thing because even at that time, I don't know exactly when the Matsya Purana was written, but even at that time, there's a great amount of expertise that is there in, that was already developed in medicine. So I'll go over it in a little bit of detail. Basically, Shalya was surgery using blunt and sharp instruments. And there's he goes into some detail about that, not a great amount of detail, but there is some detail. So what I'm trying to say is the expertise of surgery was already there and prevalent. And there was a certain amount of sophistication that was already present. Shakalya is a treatment of diseases afflicting ear, nose, etc. So ENT specialists were already there. And Kaya Chikitsa was general medicine and treatment of metabolic disorders, metabolic errors and disorders, basically beauty treatments and that kind of stuff, how exactly to maintain your youth and etc., all those things. And then there was Bhuta Vidya, that is demonology, and also mental ailments, all those things come under this heading. And Kaumara Bhritya is pediatrics. And then Agada Tantra or Agada Tantra, I am not very sure about the pronunciation, I apologize. So this was about toxicology and treatment of diseases, conditions occurring due to bites and stings of animals and so on. Again, Matsya Purana devotes a lot of time and energy to describe exactly how this is done. So poisons are dealt with in great amount of detail. And Rasayana Tantra is geriatrics, anti-aging medicine, immune modulators, and so on, rejuvenation. And Vajikarana Tantra is aphrodisiacs and medicines and methods used to increase sexual prowess, potency, and virility. All those things they have been described in great detail. SPIES. So the agency of SPIES, just like Arthashastra, Matsya Purana also devotes a great amount of time describing how spies are going to be chosen and employed and sent to various places. So spies were both internal and external. External spies were sent to enemy territories and even allies, to the allied kings' territories. Internal spies were usually people who kind of watched over the council members and the ministers and the workers in the government and so on. Internal spies were there to specifically understand the trends, lives and opinions of the citizens, conduct of the government servants. External spies were there for the movement of enemies. Like Kautilya says, spies are the eyes of a king. And but spies were also watched in some sense. No spies account was taken as sacrosanct. So to arrive at a certain conclusion, 4 spies with a single mandate were given, and the information was culled from them, and it was kind of moderated. Then we have law and order. This is a very interesting topic. So no one was outside the ambit of Rajadanda. In other words, no matter how high up in the food chain a particular person was, even a minister or a Brahmin or educator or anybody, or even a member of the king's family, was not outside the ambit of Rajadanda. So they had to respect the Rajadanda. A great deal of information is given about the sentencing codes. In other words, like what kind of punishment is given to what kind of crime. So Matsya Purana, the author, or the the author of Matsya Purana, if you will, the authors of Matsya Purana, they go into a great amount of detail about what are the punishments that, what are the crimes that deserve the highest punishment and the lowest punishment, and so on and so forth. That's actually a very interesting topic. Actually, this is the biggest chunk of the Rajadharma, actually. So just to give you a couple of examples, let me just find that thing for you. This is actually pretty interesting. I found it completely fascinating, the amount of detail that is given. So Matsya Purana classifies, there are like, you had fines, and then you had death penalty, and then you had physical punishment, all these things. So the highest offenses, including treachery, they incurred death penalty. And there is also this injunction about the king must never allow the guilty to go unpunished. It was mandated upon the king to not let people go unpunished. On the other hand, he must not punish the innocent. That was the other mandate that was given to the king. So then there was like, hoarding the inventory, like hoarding the grains was actually was very severely punishable. So if you adulterate inventory to gain profit, and if you secretly sell goods for an inflated price, all those things, they were all fined at a certain amount of, at a certain level. And then a merchant selling similar goods of the same quality at different prices must be fined at a nominal level. But if he sells goods of different quality at the same price, he should be fined at a higher level. So there are that kind of detail that you go into. Let me find some other things. So an incendiary. So a person, atatayin, a person is an atatayin if he's an incendiary, a poisoner, or who raises a weapon to strike a robber, who forcibly takes away land, an abductor of another man's wife, atatayin. So all these things, they were called atatayins. And those people, anyone who slays an atatayin is not a criminal. And an atatayin basically deserves corporal punishment. So that's a prescription that is given. And rape was actually punishable by death. Adultery is punished by fining the person committing adultery very, very heavily. So there are some great amount of detail that the Matsya Purana goes into. Some of the punishments are kind of seen as excessive perhaps in modern times, but the theory behind the sentencing code seems to have been more like a deterrent. Like, severe punishment is offered just so people will not commit those crimes. So that was that seems to have been the theory, the attitude behind the rather severe sentencing codes. And then excommunication. So an egregious crime like a Mahapataka was actually deserving of excommunication. So people would perform what was called a ghataspota and then excommunicate people. And that also kind of seems, even people who were actually consorting with, having a social intercourse with, Mahapatakins were also excommunicated. Anybody who is a fallen person who does not adhere to a social code was deemed worthy of excommunication. And then there's a lot of detail that is given about the forts, the kind of forts, the, what kind of palaces should be there, and roads, official residences, treasuries, stables, arsenal, gardens, etc., etc. And then a great amount of thought is given to the kind of inventories to stock, like what kind of food should be stocked, poison, the animals, snakes, medicines, herbs. And what I found interesting was that the snakes were grown in pots. So they were called ghatasapas. And certain, the kind of snakes that were actually grown in pots, and they were used for their venom and stuff. And there were 6 kinds of forts that were identified. Those that were in the middle of a desert, those inside, like in the middle of a water body, in the earth, whether like concealed entrances that were the Bhu Durgas, and then Vana Durgas, the forest Durgas, then Giri Durgas. And those that were actually protected, strategically protected by an army. So amongst all these things, mountain Durgas were supposed to be the safest. And then we come to this art of diplomacy. Again, it is a strategic framework of how to deal with, everybody. Actually, people who are inside, like, basically people who are your employees, your council of ministers, your own people, your government servants, everybody, and your allies and your enemies. How exactly are you supposed to deal with all these different constituencies? So that was that's the focus of this framework. So we know the first four: Sama, Dana, Bheda, and Danda. Sama is the art of conciliation and discussion. Dana is giving gifts and grafts. Bheda is sowing dissension. And Danda is war, making war, or punishment, for internal purposes, giving punishment to the people who are criminals and stuff like that. And then war, making war against your enemies and so on. And within that, Yana or expedition was like, how do you march against an enemy? Added to these four, Matsya Purana defines 3 more ways of dealing with enemies. So one is Upeksha, stance of neutrality. And then there is Maya, a baser diplomacy that advocates cunning, and a different level, Indrajala, that uses stratagem in war. So Maya incorporates magic, deception, fraud, illusion, conjuring, jugglery, etc., etc. So just to give you an example, Maya is more like what Kautilya used against a Rakshasa. So Maya is something that is a lot of your trickery, your planning is not seen outside. Indrajala is something that appears different from what is actually happening. Like, for example, if you know the story of Yogadharayana and Udayana. So what Yogadharayana used is Indrajala versus Maya. So that is the kind of difference. I would go into greater detail, but I guess I'll stop right here. And there is expedition. Like, when you go on an expedition for Yana, there are a whole different things, like, who exactly are your enemies? Who exactly are your friends? A great amount of definitions and explanations are given. So Vijigishu is a guy that's the king who's interested in conquest. And Ari is his enemy. Mitra Prakriti is his friend or allies, actually. Ari Mitra is the friend of the enemy. Mitra is the friend of your own friend. And Ari Mitra, the friend of your enemy. So exactly how do you identify your enemies and how do you identify your allies? That is basically the first leg. And then there is this, am I going past my time?
You're approaching the time to conclude, ma'am.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
I see final thoughts there. So probably you're also
yeah. So there is the kings behind Vijigishu, like, Parsnigraha is a guy who's always trying to attack, the enemy, who's strategizing to attack you from behind. Akranta is a friend who's always got your back, and so on. And friend of the enemy and the friend of the friend, and so on. And Madhyama is a guy who's a conduit of information between your allies and enemies, and so on. And Udasina is the guy who's like who is non-aligned. So basically, this is the framework to identify the and allies that he is dealing with. So the final thoughts. Matsya Purana has got a lot of information that is very similar to what is given in Kautilya's Arthashastra. And it also has a lot of its own information. And the Lakshya, the aim of Matsya Purana is also very similar to what Kautilya's Arthashastra had actually. So the final objective of Kautilya's Arthashastra and Matsya Purana's Rajadharma are kind of similar. And then Matsya Purana, in this particular Rajadharma, it's modeling polity and foreign relationships. And it offers a great amount of insights for historians, sociologists, policymakers, students, and practitioners of Ayurveda. Of course, there is the Saptanga modeling, which is like, it's like a strategy textbook, and sixfold policy similarly. And the art of war and modeling external relationships is offered. So basically, here's my final final thoughts, basically. So over time, we have lost the terminology used to describe all these concepts. And you have to be able to familiarize yourself with the terminology to go back and then understand what the Matsya Purana is trying to tell you. And again, Matsya Purana offers a remarkably thorough and strategic method of thinking about polity and governance. And there are several unique insights, like I said, offered by this Purana. And of course, it reinforces and restates a lot of information that is given in Arthashastra. So my final word, if we lose this kind of information, this kind of a framework, we are going to lose a lot. So this needs to be studied in greater detail and with a lot more strategic depth. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. There are questions from the audience. Most of the questions are focused on what you touched upon during the final thoughts, the connection between Arthashastra and the Rajadharma portions of Matsya Purana. So is there anything that Matsya Purana adds different from the Kautilya's Arthashastra? Is it the same?
Yes. Yes, no, it's not exactly same, but a lot of it is similar. But like I said, Samadhana, Bheda, Danda, that is the typical framework. So Matsya Purana adds the, the policy of non-alignment, the policy of Indrajala, and the policy of Maya. All these things are added. They are specific only to Matsya Purana. They're not there in Arthashastra, for example. And also the code of all those sentencing codes and all those things, they're kind of different. They're similar and they're also different. Does it make sense?
Yeah. And apart from the Arthashastra Matsya Purana question, the one question is about a very micro level point, the free will versus destiny discussion. Though yes, actually it was just part of a larger suggestions to the king. The question is actually focusing on the Rajadharma only from a free will point of view. The question is, this person is calling himself anonymous attendee, and he's saying, what if a criminal says that it was his destiny, not free will, to commit the crime?
Very interesting question. I don't know. It could actually be. So, okay, fine. Here is how I'm going to address this. So basically, this particular thing, the concept of Utthana and the destiny versus free will discussion is especially for the training, a princess training. So this particular portion is trying to inspire the prince to strive harder, to make sure that the free will is not trivial. So he must actually strive harder to attain whatever the goals that he's attaining, and so on and so forth. Now, coming to the question, the Matsya Purana also has this very interesting kind of a thing. If the prince is not deserving, in case he becomes very stubborn, he becomes very intransigent, then the Matsya Purana actually advises, okay, he should be imprisoned. He should be taken away from public gaze and then put away somewhere and then he should not be allowed to be a prince. The succession stops there. You must develop somebody else. So in other words, a criminal, if he becomes a criminal, then the Rajadanda is the thing that is final. Because even Matsya Purana is advocating that even for a prince, if the training fails, put him away. That is the prescription.
Yeah. Are there any references for further study on this topic of Rajadharma in Matsya Purana?
I gave a whole bunch of references in my paper. There is this, let's see, there is this Jagdish Lal Shastri, Political Thought in Puranas, University of Punjab, but that is not something that I would recommend. There is this V.R. Ramachandra Dikshitar, a study, University of Madras, 1935. That is actually very good. So what I did was, like, the Maharaja of Mysore has commissioned a whole bunch of translations of all the Puranas. Unfortunately, everything is in Kannada. So Matsya Purana, what I have referred to mainly is the Matsya Purana translation in Kannada, the original translated to Kannada. That is there in vyasaonline.com. He's curated everything and then kept it there. So if you want a Kannada source, that is the original translation of Matsya Purana into Kannada.
Thank you very much, ma'am.